Paris, the name seems to go back to about the 12th century when a family named Perrys, or spelled in varying ways, P-E-R-Y-S sometimes, they apparently lived here. It has no French connection at all as far as I can make out. Bredon Springs is the name we gave to our house when we bought it 40 years ago. Of course, we're on the spring line. In fact, that's why Paris was a hamlet and inhabited at all. To me, of course, I liked the soils, I liked the situation with the view of the Cotswolds over the other side of the valley. And, of course, the water was a big attraction, as it had been for previous people for centuries. It is an almost unique site. Very few gardens have got so many natural advantages as this has. The winters have varying effects on plants. Some winters, of course, this would be cut right to the ground. Others, like this last one, well, it was green right to the top. And normally this isn't in flower till late May or June. This year, in flower for the 1st of April, last to March, I think, really. It's the Chilean vine, Ecremocarpus, and it's one of our nicest climbers. It's allowed to grow just as it will here. We don't do any tying up or training. Well, that applies to the whole garden, really. You mustn't assume I'm working full-time in the garden. As a matter of fact, I've done comparatively little gardening in the last 6 months. I've had to take it a bit easier. I've got a young man that does a couple of days a week in the garden, and I don't think there is a typical day. I mean, I do my housework, a bit of cooking, a bit of writing and so on. But when it comes to the garden, well, I go out, and if a job looks as though it wants doing and I feel in the mood for doing it, then it gets done. But I'm a bit inclined to pick my jobs, and I'll pick an easy job rather than a hard one very often. This is an interesting plant, one of the introductions from Japan last century. It's one of several plants that goes under the name of Japanese iris, and it looks more like an odontoglossum orchid. Done very well this year. In fact, this is as good a clump as I've ever seen. And it's a pretty little thing. It likes full sun. This is one of the Chinese tree peonies. It's particularly interesting because it's one of the plants discovered by the French Jesuit missionary de Lavey. He was one of the most wonderful discoverers of plants. Although much of the stuff he sent back as dried specimens, he didn't introduce a lot of live material. But this Peonia de Lavey is one of his most interesting introductions. Of course, it's finished flowering now. It was in bloom a few weeks ago, but it's a good foliage plant right through till the end of the summer. It's quite an attractive thing. Foxgloves, of course, are very much British natives, but we like them. They seed down all over the place. We let them stay where they put themselves. The horsetail is one of our weeds that we learn to live with. This is a giant horsetail, not all that common. We live with it. It goes back to the coal measures, and it's got an ancestry that I think is worth some respect. Weeds among vegetable crops, I mean, you want to eliminate them. My attitude to weeds in other places is certainly to get rid of them as far as possible. Some of the perennial weeds are really quite obnoxious, and we do go to a lot of trouble to reduce them. We've got weeds here which we shall never get rid of. In fact, the great horsetail I've mentioned when we were in the garden. oh, it isn't a bad weed, it's a pretty nice looking weed, we live with it, we understand each other. But in the main, I believe in the elimination of weeds, but if you can do it by planting smother crops, smother plants, some of our herbaceous stuff like hostas and things, they make a solid jam and no weed can possibly survive. That is the way to control weeds. This is one of the giants of the garden. I do like big things, you know, they fill up and take up a lot of space. It's Gunnera from Brazil. We get these leaves up to 6 feet across. They tell me that in Cornwall they get them 9 feet. I've never seen anything as big as that. There's one there that's approaching the 6 feet now. But it's an impressive, bold sort of plant for filling in a big corner. It likes moisture at the roots, and of course we've got the springs here, so although the ground looks dry on the top, in fact this thing is always got its roots down in water. But it's one of the most imposing plants we have. We don't alter sites to suit plants. We choose a plant to suit a site. And if it doesn't like it and dies, well, we choose something else. But we do the minimum of work and the minimum of alteration of ground. Very high lime almost everywhere, so we don't try to grow rhododendrons. If I wanted to grow rhododendrons, I'd go and buy a cottage on the Welsh border or something like that. This is another one of the plants that de Lave found, but this is interesting because the genus is Incarvillea. It's Incarvillea de Lavei, and Incarville was another Jesuit missionary, so this one has a double dose of Jesuit in it, but quite an important plant, I think, for Catholics to grow. We're still in China with these primulas. This is Primula bulliana, an introduction about the turn of the century, or early this century, from China. And it's one of the candelabra group, which there's a lot of them in the Far East. They're very successful garden plants if there's plenty of moisture. These do particularly well here. You see, I'm a very keen botanist, field botanist, and I was anxious to have every plant family represented that I could possibly get. And this was the basis of my original gardening going back many years. Then I became more interested in the regions from which the plants came, and I started making sure that we'd got every country in the world covered. We had our New Zealand collection and even a few isolated things from the Chatham Islands that are not found anywhere else at all, and so on. So the geographical approach became dominant. Now, I don't know, they both have an influence, but I'm probably more concerned over the last 15 years with wildlife and getting as many birds nesting here as we can. So you see, there's always different pressures being put on to one, and one's aims do change a little as the years go by. We've now got one of my favourites. These are the old-fashioned columbines. All the types we have here go back to Tudor times, and we don't have the long-spurred ones in the garden because they cross and you get a lot of mixed mongrels. But some of these doubles, this is a spurless double, described by Gerard of 1597 and Parkinson a bit later in great detail. And some of these double spurred ones are rather intriguing because the spurs fit one inside another like a lot of ice cream cones. But I'm rather pleased now because we've got pretty well a full set of them. It's taken me some years to get them collected, but I'm rather pleased with them now. From being a botany teacher, I've now, my lecture work for adult education work now is almost entirely plant history, and our Tudor plants are just one facet of that. But I'm interested in the history of plant collection from all over the world, the people who found the plants and sent them over, and the first people to get them to flower or something like that. Those are the things that now interest me. You can almost say I had the botanical period, the geographical period, and now it's the historical period, I suppose. History seems to suit declining years. I don't know. Well, you can't do science when you're my age. You've got to give it up at some time or other. This is another one of the Tudor flowers. It's one of my favourites, Sweet Rocket. It was probably in Britain in medieval times, but it's been a popular old cottage garden flower for many, many years. And we let them seed down, they just come up where they think they will. We've got a deep purple form, a light purple form, and a white form. We've got them all three together here. And you never quite know what you're going to get till they flower, but they're sweetly scented, a nice thing. This is our south bank, and we used to have it mainly as a kitchen garden. We still have vegetables here, a few. But we use these cloches for rooting cuttings. They are the genuine cloche, being a bell, and they came over from France before the First World War. Used to be thousands of them in use at Evesham. They grew early marrows and outdoor cucumbers under them in the old days. Of course, those days have gone. I've got most of them that are left now, I think. I bought all I could. We put cuttings under them in September, and cuttings of lavender, santalinas, all those sort of things. And they rooted by March, April, May when we pot them up. We don't use them in the summer because they overheat so easily, and there isn't much we can do with them in the summer. But as a winter protection for cuttings, it's still the best way of propagating a lot of those plants. Much cheaper than some of the heated prop benches, which can take a bit of managing. I'm a great respecter of soil. It is the only thing that never wears out. I mean, you can dig all the coal, you can pump all the oil out of the North Sea, but you never destroy soil. It'll go on cropping for thousands of years and thousands of years after that. And I'm a great respecter of soil. And I've seen so many gardens ruined. They're on a slope. You've got a clay subsoil, you've got 8 or 9 inches of decent topsoil, but they must bulldoze it and terrace it, and they've lost the topsoil before they know where they are, and they're working on subsoil clay, and it's never satisfactory. And this desire to move great quantities of soil on a site and to judge your success on the tonnage you shifted per hour or something like that, I think is absolute folly. If a land is sloping gently like that, you say leave it gently sloping, keep the topsoil where it is. You can create a garden on a slope as we have done here. This is an American rose, Helen Traubel or Traubel. It's really a hybrid tea, and conventional rose growers would prune it pretty hard and keep it close to the ground. We let it grow as a shrub rose with almost no pruning, and of course we get hundreds of blooms. This bush is over 30 years old now, and it doesn't show any signs of loss of vigour. We prune very lightly. It gets no black spot, no mildew, and no aphids. We don't get aphids anyway, the birds keep those down. But a lot of these hybrid tea roses, I'm sure, are better grown with light pruning. You may not get exhibition blooms, but you get very fine blooms. Well, I wouldn't say that I looked after plants very well. I know heaps of amateurs who know far less botany than I do and far less plant history than I do, who still grow the plants better than I do because they go to a lot of fuss. You see, I tend to stick a plant in the ground and let it look after itself. If it dies, we say, well, why did it die? Should we try it somewhere else, or should we stop trying it? I don't think I'm a good grower of plants. I think I'm a good chooser of sites for plants, but they have to grow themselves. Some of the ladies I know go to infinite trouble to grow plants, far better than I do. They really do. They live for them. I don't. It's a strange thing. I'm not a good grower, I don't think. Yes, well, we say this is a wild garden, and this, this area illustrates it very much. These are teasels, of course, which goldfinches love when they are seeding, and we allow a lot of them to grow, too many sometimes. Here's our inevitable horsetail, which we have already mentioned. There's a skullcap here, which we do grow as a garden plant, but it seeds itself down and becomes a weed at times. There's a few of the inevitable columbines there, but one thing fights with another, and the general effect is not too bad. I like it anyway, put up with it. This is acanthus, said to have inspired designers from all the days of the ancient Greeks onwards. Arthur Negus used to be fond of talking about that design on a chair leg, the acanthus on the chair leg he used to talk about. And it is an imposing plant. The flower spikes will come up a bit later on, of course, but a very impressive plant, a thing I'm fond of. I always wanted an oak wood, and at least I've got an oak tree, and we grow a few things underneath it. In the late spring, the hellebores are rather fine here, but at the moment, Welsh poppies seem to be about the only thing. But we've got a number of other things hidden away among the jungle. But I like my oak wood. Creating a garden, which is an art, it is a form of art, but it differs from most of the others in that it's changing all the time. You've not only got seasonal change, but you've got yearly change. I mean, an oak tree is bigger today than it was 20 years ago, and therefore you've got different plants underneath. You've got lower light intensity, and it's a fascinating thing, is living with a garden, especially with all the wildlife thrown in as well. And you can't, one year is bound to be different from every other year. No 2 years can be the same, and if a year, 5 years' time is the same, the garden is 5 years older. Some more of our moisture-loving primulas. This bed at one time of day was very wet, almost boggy, even in the middle of summer. But after the droughts of 75, 76, we seem to lose the shallow water, although there's still plenty of water underneath. but all the plants here like moisture, not only the primulas, but the royal fern up here. It grows much better in Wales than it does here, but it still survives. It'll be 6 feet high by the end of the season, and it's quite good considering it's a limey soil. They're supposed not to like lime at all. There's an interesting little thing here. There's a caterpillar, one of the golden plusia moths that eats this thing. But recently, the sparrows have cleared them right up when they feed their young, and I can't see any on it this year. Some years it's quite bad. The main, particularly over the last 20, 25 years, 30 years perhaps, is a sort of a deep feeling that anything alive has a right to live unless it's really making itself a terrible nuisance. And so we encourage wildlife, birds of all kinds. We rough mow the lawn and are not very fussy about weeds. Well, we don't regard them as weeds in the lawn. Any plant that grows in the lawn is accepted. Of course, we like earthworms, and if you've got earthworms in the lawn, you'll have moles. You can get rid of moles and earthworms and the whole lot by putting plenty of poisons down. And if this were a putting green, we'd have to do that. But a putting green, of course, there are only 3 things allowed to live. One is the grass, the other is the greenkeeper, and the other is the golfer. And anything else alive that dares to show its face is immediately slaughtered, unless it's down to bacteria level, and even they may not be welcomed at times. Okay. This is an interesting feature here. It's a woodland cave. The idea was that we'd have a low ground cover and then filled in at the back. These ferns have come on their own and we've allowed them to grow, and it's spoilt the effect to some extent. But it still has quite a cave-like feeling about it. We've had willow warblers nesting here, and robins regularly nest at the base of that crabapple tree. Looking through there, there's a little gap, and you can see Nymphea. That's Charles Hazard's sculpture, which we've got against the yew backing, and I think she's an addition to the garden. She's quite attractive and well behaved, and well, shortly, I like Nymphea. I think she's rather good. We get some odd accidents, you know, from time to time. Almost all foxgloves are spotted inside, whether they be white ones or other colours. This is a very fine, pure white foxglove, wholly without spots, and I'm going to save seed from it and see if we can get it to come true. It's a very promising looking plant. Just one of those accidents. Indian pokeweed. This is a plant from the Atlantic states and North America, Virginia and thereabouts, and it's a bit of a roadside weed, I think, but I believe it's slightly narcotic. I believe when it gets better known, you know, it'll take the place of pot or something like that. Anyway, we grow it in odd corners. We've got a big lot of it up there, and this is an odd one. It seeds itself down and becomes a bit of a weed, really. Oh, there's another plant here of interest. This is the elecampane. It used to be used as a bronchial medicine. In fact, I think it still is in some of the patent medicines. It has yellow daisies and plants about this high. They look awfully untidy when they've faded and finished, but we don't do any deadheading here. The place looks a bit of a mess. You come September and the goldfinches come for the seed. We may have as many as a dozen or 15 goldfinches feeding on these innulas. We've got a lot more, of course, up above there. And it's worth having the untidiness if you can have the goldfinches. Another link with birds, this is typical hosta. It's a big one, as you can see, it's 6 feet across, I should think. Not a trace of slug damage on it. In some gardens they're shredded with slugs, but all our hostas, there's a lot more over there, are all quite free of slug damage. I think it's blackbirds that take the slugs in the winter. They work so hard among the herbaceous plants, sort of pulling up leaves and things like that. And I'm quite convinced that that's where the slugs go. We don't put slug pellets down. We haven't done any slug baiting for 20 years, except occasionally in the greenhouse, where of course the birds don't usually get. But I'm certain that that's what happens to the slugs on the hostas. We feed birds in the winter. We encourage the maximum number of birds. We see that there's plenty of dead heads left on for birds, to the seed-eating birds. Of course, we don't win all the battles. In fact, nature is continually struggling within itself, and some things go under. I wish a few more rabbits would go under. We've got too many rabbits. They are a little bit of a pest. But I think the way out of rabbits, and I'm slowly coming to the conclusion, there are certain plants rabbits will not eat. And if we eliminate the plants that rabbits like to eat, then the rabbits will finish up eating clover on the lawn, and what could be better than that? I think that's what, in 10 years' time, we probably won't have any plants that rabbits like, apart from the clover on the lawn. There are two things that historians seem to be agreed upon. One is that Alfred burnt the cakes, and the other is that the Britons painted themselves with woad, and this is woad. When it's in full bloom, it's quite a bright golden colour, quite pleasant, not all that showy, but this is just going over now. It's not much bloom left on it. It's the leaves that are used for the dye, and I think until this century it was still being used in the Yorkshire woolen industry, but it slowly faded out. Not a very stable dye, I don't think. But we let a bit of it grow just for the fun of the thing. It's not the most ornamental of plants, but another nice glaucous foliage.